This video is meant to help give you a little bit of direction in for the assignment on looking at what survey or what scale to use, and particularly you have it set up for looking at scales and measuring spiritual development. So some of the things that we look at regarding assessment types of scales, different surveys that are used. Two of the main things are what kind of evidence do they have for the reliability or the validity of the measure. So the reliability is about how consistent is the measure. So validity is about accuracy, reliability is about consistency. So in the consistency evidence, you might see things like test retest. Reliability, what we consider temporal consistency. That is, if I were to give you, if I wanted to look at the reliability of an IQ measure, I give you that IQ today and give it to you a month from now, and your scores should be pretty consistent with one another. And we would do that with a number of people and then look at the correlations between those scores. As you can imagine, this is an important assessment of reliability. Actually, it's kind of difficult to obtain, not horribly difficult, but it is time consuming to obtain. So oftentimes we don't see test retest reliability information. You're more likely to see evidence for internal consistency, or oftentimes what's called Cronbach's alpha. And so this is really kind of getting at how well do all the items in the scale kind of hang together? Do they seem to be measuring the same things? So example could be they could provide item total correlations there that they should be roughly 0.30 or higher. These are just correlation coefficients between the two. Or they might provide the Cronbach's alpha itself right here, which generally the minimum requirement for that is 0.70 of what you would see. Um, in other areas, they might give you maybe inter-observer or inter-rater reliability, and actually we'll be going through that when we talk about the rubrics that we use, trying to look at inter-rater agreement for those rubrics. The validity, again, as I was saying, is how accurate is the measure? Does a measure measure what you say it does? Okay. For IQ, how is it that we know that this is really measuring intelligence? Or not just, as oftentimes is the case, people say that it's just really maybe measuring social class or measuring access to power, maybe, or those kinds of things. So there's the what we call construct validity. So we can do this in two different ways of looking at construct validity: convergent evidence or discriminant evidence. Most likely to see convergent evidence. So an example might be of using known groups. Again, let's say if it was a scale on empathy, groups that we would expect to score high on empathy, maybe they are therapists or others in social workers, others. We give them the empathy scale, and then maybe we give that scale to convicts. That we would expect that the therapists and the social workers would score significantly higher than the convicts on that empathy scale. Oftentimes the evidence that you see is correlations with other similar constructs or similar measures as that one. Or what's really kind of a gold standard is correlations with behaviors related to the construct. So if it's, again, our measure of empathy, and then so we have that measure of empathy, and then we correlate that with how it is that they display empathy in an actual setting. We look at their actual behaviors in that situation. Discriminant validity is to say it shouldn't correlate with something else. So for the most classic example for this is social desirability. So if you've got an empathy measure, can we show that this is actually measuring empathy and not just social desirability, that people want to come off looking as empathic? So there should be no correlations between that and a measure of social desirability. Empirical validity kind of gets at the same kind of thing of looking at the behavior. So how well do they correlate with the behavior that we'd expect to see in other contexts? And again, the behavioral aspect really is a gold standard. It's hard to get that evidence, but when that evidence exists, that's what's most influential. Other aspects of validity that oftentimes you'll see is either is content validity, and so does it reflect what we would expect out of that particular domain. It might be, is it capturing all aspects of empathy, of what we consider to be empathy, that is emotional aspects, but also the cognitive aspects of it. And again, as I mentioned before, the validity evidence that's linked to behaviors, that's what's most persuasive. And then also on reliability, the reminders that reliability is needed for validity to take place. But just because a measure is reliable doesn't mean it's a valid measure. An example of this is, back in the 1800s, Sir Francis Galton in England, one of his measures for intelligence was actually the size of one's head. Now, I love that measure because I got a big honking head. I wish that was a good indicator of intelligence. And for that, we know that you can get a reliable measure of that. You measure my head today, measure my head tomorrow, it should be the same size. So it would be consistent measure. But just because it's consistent doesn't mean that it's a valid measure. Does this actually predict how intelligent I am? And the evidence doesn't exist for that. Other considerations here are that are important are the audience. We've got this measure, but is this measure going to be good for the audience that we have? Let's say if what I need this for is for the population that we have, I need this for children, or I need this for geriatric population. That same measure, let's say, of depression might not work for both populations. And that's one thing for you to think about for looking at these different scales. Does this seem to fit a college student population? Also, do they have comparable types of data? So can we compare our results for our student population with a national average? Oftentimes, that's not thought about enough, I think, by institutions. And that question about, okay, you have this assessment evidence, and then what are you comparing it to? Compared to what? How do we know whether or not they're actually doing well or not, or poorly or not? The length of the survey scale, is it unwieldy? Are there hundreds of items to where we're just not going to be able to get students to be able to take that? And then does the scale or does the survey fit with the institutional goals or outcomes? If there's not much of a fit there, you got a question as to whether or not you really should be using that particular scale.